Good evening, folks. Now, this evening's topic C is titled The Caregiving Cliff in 2026. Okay, so we'll have a discussion about that article title. So here we go with the presentation I made for you. Please sit back and enjoy. And remember, if anybody has any questions for me, leave them in the chat below for me, please. And we'll see if we can do another show with everybody's questions. Here we go with tonight's C. The piece describes a caregiving cliff in 2026, a rapidly escalating, largely invisible crisis in which unpaid and undersupported family caregivers are being pushed out of the workforce because federal support, funding, and policy infrastructure have failed to keep pace with the scale of need. The article frames caregivers as the silent backbone of the U.S. economy, people who hold families and communities together, yet whose labor remains structurally unsupported. Drawing on recent caregiving statistics and vivid descriptions of financial and emotional strain. The article shows how long hours, rising out-of-pocket costs, and the absence of federal investment are driving a measurable workforce exodus. Key points the page makes. Caregiving is widespread, intensive, and often unplanned. Nearly 1 in 4 caregivers provide 40 hours plus of care per week, essentially working a second full-time job. Many have been caregiving for 5 years or more. Reflecting long-term chronic responsibilities rather than short-term crises. Most people do not choose caregiving, it chooses them. Often suddenly and without preparation. Financial harm is severe and common. Nearly half of caregivers report at least one major financial impact: taking on debt, stopping retirement contributions, or struggling to afford food. These pressures accumulate over time, eroding household stability and long-term financial security. Workforce exits are accelerating. The article highlights that 42% of women are leaving the workforce due to insufficient caregiver support. This is not a matter of personal preference, but of structural impossibility. Caregiving demands collide with rigid workplace, forcing people, especially women, to step away from paid employment. A workforce exodus is underway. The article defines this as a large number of employees leaving not because of layoffs, but because systematic pressures make staying untangible. Caregivers are leaving because continuing to work becomes economically irrational or physically unsustainable. Why this matters: economic and social impact, labor supply, and productivity. When caregivers reduce hours or quit, employers lose experienced staff, institutional knowledge, and productivity sectors with high concentrations of caregivers, healthcare, education, and service. Inequities face deeper staffing shortages and burnout cycles. Household financial security, lost wages combined with rising caregiving expenses create a double blind. Families lose income while simultaneously absorbing new costs for medical care, transportation, equipment, and daily living needs. This dynamic pushes many households into long-term financial precarity. Health and community of care. Caregivers experiencing chronic stress, sleep disruption, and burnout often see their own health decline. This affects not only their well-being, but also the stability and quality of care provided to children, older adults, and chronically ill loved ones. Gender equity and long-term wealth gaps. Because women disproportionately shoulder unpaid care, the caregiving cliff widens. Gender gaps in earnings, promotions, retirement savings, and long-time wealth accumulation. Main drivers the article highlights. Insufficient federal funding. and policy support. The article underscores that the absence of robust federal caregiving programs, paid leave, long-term care financing, caregiver stipends, respite services forces families to absorb costs and labor that public systems fail to cover. High time demands and conflict with paid work. Many caregivers are effectively working 2 full-time jobs, one paid, one unpaid. The conclusion of these roles makes sustained employment unrealistic. Rising out-of-pocket costs. Caregivers pay for medical supplies, home modifications, transportation, and basic living expenses that quickly exceed what most households can manage. Lack of workforce flexibility. Without predictable schedules, remote options, or caregiver leave, many workers cannot meet both employer expectations and caregiving needs. Practical implications and policy levers, as discussed in or implied. Paid family and medical leave would allow caregivers to remain attached to the workforce while managing acute or chronic care needs. Direct caregiver supports, tax credits, stipends, respite care, subsidies for home and community-based services would reduce the financial shock that currently forces many to quit. Long-term care investment at the federal level could reduce reliance on unpaid family labor by expanding access to affordable professional care, employer accommodations such as flexible scheduling, hybrid work, and formal caregiver leave policies can significantly reduce turnover and preserve workforce participation. Public recognition and cultural reframing of caregiving as essential labor, not a private family issue, could help shift policy priorities and reduce stigma around asking for supports. One sentence takeaway. The article argues that without stronger federal support in 2026, the crushing combination of long hours, financial strain, and inadequate policy infrastructure is pushing family caregivers, especially women, out of the workforce with profound consequences for families, employers, and the broader economy. Is there a particular angle, policy, workforce, gender equality, or caregiver lived experience you want to develop further for your presentation or toolkit? Okay, guys, now here's the second half of C, which the title will be, it's a Q&A, frames the caregiver crisis as a large worsening mismatch between growing care. That's the second half of C. So please join me for the second half of C. Okay. Needs in shrinking public supports. Millions of unpaid or paid and unpaid caregivers are already strained, and recent federal legislation that cuts Medicaid funding will intensify that pressure by reducing paid care capacity and shifting more care onto families. Key facts and scale. 63 million people in the U.S. provide care, paid or unpaid. 53 million are unpaid family caregivers who deliver the bulk of in-home care, contributing roughly $870 billion in annual value. About 5 million are paid caregivers. Their jobs and wages are vulnerable to proposed Medicaid cuts. How the crisis developed. Mechanisms. Demographics and labor shifts. An aging population increases demand for long-term care while dual earner households reduce the pool of available unpaid family labor that historically filled that gap. Policy changes that reduce capacity. The article explains that the OBB legislation reduces Medicaid funding, limits pilot programs, including caregiver stipends, and tightens facility eligibility, shrinking the paid care workforce and nursing home capacity that pushes more people back into unpaid family care. Administrative barriers. Existing stipend and respite programs are small and hard to access. Complex paperwork and inspections make them impractical for many caregivers. Consequences highlighted on the page. More unpaid caregiving and burnout. Cuts to respite and Stipend programs will increase caregiver burnout and reduce the system's ability to sustain long-term care at home. Downstream health systems strain, reduced nursing home capacity, and fewer supports at home will likely increase emergency room use, delay diagnoses, and prolong recoveries, creating costs the system ultimately reabsorbs. Workforce and economic ripple effects. Fewer paid caregivers and more family members leaving or reducing paid work will erode workforce capacity and household financial stability. Policy responses, the article suggests or implies. Protect and expand Medicaid funded caregivers supports, respite care, stipends, pilot programs so family caregivers can take breaks and remain economically stable. Implement caregiver needs assessments at the state level to identify gaps and design targeted supports. Simplify access to existing programs. Introduce paperwork, streamline eligibility and inspections so supports reach caregivers who are already time pressed. Practical implications for different audiences. Policymakers. Cutting Medicaid now risk larger downstream costs. ER use, delayed care, longer recoveries, and a heavier unpaid care burden. Investing in respite and stipends can reduce those downstream effects. Employers expect higher turnover and absenteeism where employees shoulder unpaid caregiving. Workplace flexibility and caregiver leave policies can mitigate talent loss. Advocates and communities prioritize outreach that helps caregivers navigate existing programs and push for state caregiver needs assessments to build evidence for expanded supports. One sentence takeaway: cuts to Medicaid and limited caregiver programs are accelerating a caregiver crisis that shifts care from paid settings to unpaid family members, increasing burnout, health system strain, and economic harm. Okay, guys, that is it for now. I might try and jump back on later tonight for AD. But for now, Gator Wellness. Take care, folks. See you tomorrow for shows, or maybe later, like I said. So we'll see after dinner how I feel. Okay, so with that being said, I might jump on later. Okay, I'll see you guys later. For now, Gator Wellness. Take care, folks.